It turns out that for decades, there's been this account in the US called the Donor Advised Fund that most people have never heard of.
Yep.
But it's kind of the perfect account if you care about giving to charity, right? You put money aside, you can put stock in it, crypto, very tax efficient. The money's invested tax-free. The problem is the market's mostly oriented that product towards the wealthy. Mm-hmm. And we have a number of large accounts at Daffy now, 6, 7, 8-figure accounts. But a lot of the motivation for Daffy was this idea that, about 50 to 60 million households in the US give to charity every year. Could we turn this into a product for everyone instead of just for the wealthy?
Hey everyone, welcome to Founders in Arms with me, Imad Akan, co-founder and CEO of Mercury.
And I'm Raj Suri, co-founder of Lima and Tribe. And today we have with us Adam Nash, founder CEO of Daffy. Welcome, Adam.
Glad to be here, Imad. Raj, thanks for having me.
Adam was actually at Wealthfront as the CEO there for, was it 2 years or 3 years?
Yeah, it was, I joined initially as the COO as kind of the transition. I was, at LinkedIn, we did actually a very good CEO transition, which is very rare, I think, for startups, et cetera, watching how Reed handed off to Jeff Weiner.
Yeah.
And obviously that's, fraught with problems. And so at Wealthfront, we tried to do the same thing where I came in for a period of time as the COO and then was the CEO through 2016. So I was there about 4 years overall.
So that was just before you started Daffy, right?
Yeah, there's a gap in there. I spent some time as an EIR at Greylock.
And Dropbox.
At Dropbox too, of course.
Yeah. He was the chief product officer at Dropbox. And before that, I mean, you've had a storied Silicon Valley career. I mean, well, when I think about, who's had like some of the most illustrious careers I know, it's you and people like Josh Ellman and stuff. Like, you've done some really cool things. You started off at Apple, didn't you?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Things always look different going backwards than at the time. There was no master plan.
That's a Steve Jobs quote, right?
Well, yeah, it's connecting the dots. That's right.
Right.
The Stanford graduation speech. But it's actually funny when I think about it. When I was at grad school at Stanford and looking at those first jobs, et cetera, I cannot tell you how negative folks were about Apple at the time. I mean, I literally had a bet with a roommate that Apple was. He bet me that Apple was going to be out of business within 5 years. But I actually didn't think I was joining Apple initially. I was interviewing with Next, right? So a friend of mine who was a lecturer at Stanford had worked at Next for some time. There was a lot of connections there. And I interviewed with Craig Federighi and the rest of the Web team. And then I got this funny email in December that said, hey, we're going to go dark for a little bit, but don't worry, we still love you. Kind of thing. And in the middle of my interview process, of course, the whole Steve coming back, Apple buying Next, or I don't know, did Next buy Apple? Did Apple buy Next? It was
Apple
never totally
Next.
Clear. But that's how I ended up my first job at Apple. But yeah, I went through Apple, I went to a startup after that in 98, 99, and went public in 99, business school. And then it was kind of eBay, LinkedIn, Greylock, Wealthfront, that sort of run.
Yeah, and Daffy now. Why don't you tell us what Daffy does? It's a very interesting company, relevant to a lot of founders, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at Daffy a number of different ways, but the simple idea is it's a very simple app that makes it easy to put money aside for charity, right? You get the tax deduction up front. The money's invested tax-free, and then anytime you want that money to go to any of the 1.7 million or more legal charities in the US, it's just a few taps on your phone. The name comes from, there's always a liability letting an engineer name things, but you can see from the chart, Daffy is the Donor Advised Fund for you. So the Donor Advised Fund is actually the heart of this, which is that it turns out that for decades, there's been this account in the US called the Donor Advised Fund that most people have never heard of.
Yep.
But it's kind of the perfect account if you care about giving to charity, right? You put money aside, you can put stock in it, crypto, very tax efficient. The money's invested tax-free. The problem is the market's mostly oriented that product towards the wealthy. And we have a number of large accounts at Daffy now, 6, 7, 8-figure accounts. But a lot of the motivation for Daffy was this idea that, about 50 to 60 million households in the US give to charity every year. Could we turn this into a product for everyone instead of just for the wealthy?
Do you think about Daffy as like a philanthropy business by itself, or do you think about it as like a startup that's going to be like a huge $10 million plus exit at some point?
No, I very much think of it as a startup. And actually, that's not just a motivation for the team, et cetera, or to, get investment. I actually think it's necessary for what we want to do in the sector, right? I mean, philanthropy is a huge sector. I mean, last year, I think $557 billion went to charity in the US just 1 year. That's about 2% of GDP. It's much bigger than a lot of other sectors that we talk about, agriculture, et cetera. But if you look at it, it's highly fragmented and in this kind of state because it isn't the primary focus for a lot of folks. And there's no really great technology platform company at the heart of it. And so I think there's role. I'm fairly optimistic about company formation organizations. I don't think venture-backed companies are the only types of companies or the necessarily the best types of companies for different types of problems. But for giving, I just look at all the innovation that's been going on around better ways to spend, better ways to save, better ways to invest. And I really think that one of the reasons that we haven't seen that technology migrate into philanthropy is there hasn't been a company and organization built from the ground up to really innovate and kind of drive that way. And so actually, Daffy was really based on this idea that we could build a venture-backed company in this space that made a meaningful difference to the sector.
Do you also help people pick charities? I feel like it's actually kind of tricky to go like analyze a charity, like how much are they actually spending on, giving versus marketing versus like CEO salaries, like all of these kind of factors that like actually make giving money away not necessarily like that easy.
Yeah, so we do. Although I think we're tiptoeing into it a bit because, as you mentioned, it's a hard problem. But that problem is actually a very big one. One of the reasons it's such a big problem is that we actually don't talk about the organizations that we give to enough. A lot of us don't know the organization. Like a lot of people actually struggle to even find the organizations locally. One of the fun features in Daffy is that, because we were mobile first, that makes it very easy to see the charities near you. Like it opens up a map and it shows you color-coded different organizations near you by cause, et cetera. But even simple things like, around the holidays, people wanting to volunteer at a food bank, most people don't even know where those are near them, et cetera. And so one of the things we built into Daffy from day one, which will sound so obvious to you two because, internet and that sort of thing, is just the ability that when you make a donation to a charity, we give you the option of leaving a public note about that charity. So every charity in the US has a page on Daffy. And when Daffy members make a donation, they can leave a note that explains why they give. And these notes are wonderful, right? They say things like, this is the organization that took care of my father, in the last years of his life, or this is the organization that I volunteered at for over 30 years and what we do. And I think a lot of that content, frankly, is missing from the internet. It's a little bit too much about IRS data. And as you said, what percent of expenses go where, when really, I think when people give, they're looking for also an emotional connection to the cause and the organization and trust. And so the biggest thing we've done in that space, believe it or not, is actually this is our new feature the last couple of years has really been taking off campaigns. So internet campaigns have been around for decades. Donor advised funds have been around for decades. But our motivation at Daffy is how do we help people give, right? Literally our mission is to help people be more generous more often. And we said, hey, if you have a donor advised fund, instead of making a donation to a charity, why not run a matching campaign for that charity, right? If you were going to give $1,000 to an organization, you could instead match $1,000 of other people's donations. And a lot of nonprofits see that as a more energized way to get more people involved with the organization and connected. And so that's a lot of what we've been focused on, is just kind of taking a lot of the pieces around the tech world and around the nonprofit sector and rethinking from the ground up, how can we help people inspire others to give and get the confidence to actually give to organizations that they may not have supported before.
I really like the idea of local stuff. I feel like actually smaller charities that do local things are like more effective, right? They don't have like these like must do international campaigns in weird places kind of thing. It's just like, hey, there's a small problem locally and you can help. And I like the idea of having like your family involved more. Like I would love for my kids to go do give food away to homeless people and things like that. But it's hard. Like it's, there isn't like an easy way. You just go somewhere and say like, how could my kids be involved in charity?
Yeah, there's a huge gap. It's amazing, despite decades of us building these applications and aggregating data, how many of these very real life problems are still done by word of mouth and almost ad hoc. And I agree with you. And it actually isn't hard. There usually are local organizations that are set up to take volunteers and have those experiences. It's funny. There's always a tension. I feel like there's a seesaw built into the market, almost, I don't want to say it's faddish, but there's sometimes where people really want to focus on global problems because of the scale and the impact and how many millions of people need help and these giant problems. And then sometimes there's a recognition that, actually that connection matters and time matters. And, if you don't step up to help people locally, who will? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's always this natural tension, but I think it's wonderful to teach these traditions about giving. It's been one of the great things about building a product in this space. I've always loved building products with deep emotional connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, my background, even though my undergrad was focused on engineering, I ended up going to human-computer interaction, right? So more a little bit design and design-centric thinking. And so for me, when you're in a product space where people actually deeply care about something, it's such a rich environment to design products and build products. And giving just has turned out to be a wonderful space to build in, because it is a financial task, but it's so much more than that for most people. And that gives you the opportunity to connect with people, I think, with a product and service in a way that's hard when it's just dollars and cents.
That's so cool, Adam. I can see how that'd be super motivating. Like I find also like my work and like immigration stuff is very motivating for that reason. You're helping underdogs win, right? So,
well, the truth is, I've been fortunate. You talked about kind of the career and different companies I've worked for, but I've mostly been in product roles across the companies I've been at. And if you dig under the surface, anything that finds product market fit, any software product that really goes the distance to scale, it's the humanity under it that's driving it, right? Like the real needs, right? Like eBay, you could look at eBay as a marketplace and just be fascinated with the idea of like, wow, a marketplace for any good, and how do you price it and how do you match supply and demand, et cetera. You can do that, and that's valuable. And some of the best innovations eBay had back in the day were around that. But what motivated me was, I remember the first time I went to an eBay Live and met these sellers, and you realize like, wow, for millions of people, an extra few $100s a month.
eBay did like eBay Live auctions, like in person?
Oh, they did, but that's not what I mean. They actually ran these conferences called eBay Live, and they would do them in different cities around the country. And thousands of sellers would make this pilgrimage, sometimes from around the world, just to learn more about the platform. And what you discovered, I remember one of the first features I worked on was actually to help people sell in bulk on eBay, lots. It was, people would buy in bulk, wholesale, like large amounts, and then sell them piecemeal on eBay. And I remember meeting this woman who saw my talk about the feature. She came up to me after and said, I love eBay. And, thanks to eBay, I'm making an extra, I forget what it was, $700-800 a month. It's enough to cover her kids' preschool. And she was talking about like, I'm hoping, my child, it's a gifted school. Maybe they'll grow up and work for a company like eBay someday. And these are very meaningful things. And so like when I looked at eBay, I would see the small business owners and the people who are using eBay to find income where they didn't before. At LinkedIn, of course. I mean, it's so easy to focus on high-end careers, et cetera. But the truth is, the passion at LinkedIn was just always most people don't even know what opportunities are available to them. And most companies don't even know what great talent is out there. And that's a very human problem at the heart of the labor market. Wealthfront, right? I mean, how many of us struggle with even defining or talking about our financial goals, let alone putting in place a strategy to hit them? And so, and then obviously Daffy's focused on giving. So for me, as a product leader, it's always been best for my personal kind of inspiration to go underneath and understand really who are the people using this and where are you creating value for them. In fintech, I think there's too many people. I meet founders, obviously as an angel investor, too many founders to focus on, can I sell this? Can I make money doing this?
Yeah.
Versus, are you actually creating economic value for people? And is it meaningful? And so for me, I love working on products when I know the meaning behind them.
Wealthfront is kind of like a OG fintech company, a bit of inspiration to people like Mercury. You haven't been there for 8 years, 7 years, but they just filed for a private S1 filing. So I guess they didn't reveal their numbers. Like, what did it feel to you as like being an ex-CEO there now? Like, I guess it's not the end of their journey, but like this big milestone. What was your reaction?
Oh, no, having been through 2 IPOs myself, it is not the end of the journny. Let me tell you. It's in many ways, it's just the beginning of scale. But no, it's obviously rewarding to see it happen. I mean, you guys know this as founders, but it's so hard in the early days. So many people doubt everything. I can't tell you how many people, when I went to LinkedIn, obviously I went to LinkedIn several years after it was founded, met Reed and did some of the best work of my career at LinkedIn. But I cannot tell you how many people at LinkedIn in those early days were like, yeah, but how are they going to make money? Like, will they ever make money? I mean, I think LinkedIn last year, I don't want to get it wrong, it's somewhere between $15 and $20 billion that they're now making in revenue per year. But I cannot tell you how many, I was point on recruiting, et cetera, how many engineers like, yeah, but who's ever going to pay to post their resume online? Can't they just use a homepage? I mean, these things always sound ridiculous 20 years later, but Wealthfront, oh my goodness, just the skepticism that anyone would trust a computer with their money. Or this idea that, this ongoing fight or debate about whether, a computer could give real financial advice versus a human. It just seems ludicrous in retrospect. So it's so rewarding. Actually, it's more the scale of Wealthfront that really impresses me now. I mean, when I think about it now, like 1 million or more clients, $80 billion. And the fact is, those numbers will all get bigger.
I guess when you were there, I don't know if it's public or whatever, but presumably it was just a few billion. Is it just like this compounding thing where it just like grows and grows? Like, I mean, it's been going on for like almost 20 years, right?
Well, they pivoted early, but when I was first talking to Andy and Dan in 2012, I mean, I think when I started, showed up in the office in December of 2012, I think I don't want to get the numbers wrong. I think it was about 80 million in assets and a little over 1,000 clients.
80 million. Wow.
80 million. Yeah. And so and our big race actually then was to $1 billion. It was like, hey, this is a trust business. If Wealthfront manages $1 billion, then people will be willing to trust with 50,000 or 100,000, right? Like, everyone looks at the scale of the platform kind of as a trust thing. But I can't tell you the skepticism. There were so many startups before Wealthfront that had set out to do similar things. And they had all plateaued at about 30 or 40 million in assets, right? Like, you got early adopters, people who are ready to try new tech. And so the skepticism was really, really high. But yeah, it is, these type of businesses, the thing I love about businesses that are based on long-term, like that aren't transactional businesses, they're based on long-term relationships, is they do compound over time, right? If you do a good job with your customers, trust them, et cetera, they grow with you, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, actually people who do B2B businesses tend to love this, right? Because you support a lot of companies and companies grow and mature over time and you tend to grow with them, like your services to them. It turns out that that's true in the consumer space too, but you can lose that when you build a transactional business, right? When you're focused. This is why like e-commerce for me was never quite.
Groupon is the example of that, right? It's like flash in the pan. They didn't really build long-term relationships with their customers.
It's still a $2 billion company. But
listen, let's be clear. There's some very, very big companies that are based on transactional businesses. But like even in retail, when I was at eBay, I was the guy who loved Costco and Price Club before they merged, et cetera. I was like, wait, maybe there's another model. The reason I love it, I think, is a little bit of that product basis, is that when you have a subscription business, a membership business, what do the product managers, what does the team end up focusing on, right? 3 things. One, like, how do we acquire customers? Most people have never heard of us. What do we tell them? Like, what makes them take the leap to try this thing? Once they're customers, like every month, how do we earn their business again? Like, why are they staying? Like, what are they using? Like, what's creating value for them? What are they willing to pay for? And then, of course, our, nemesis, churn, right? Like what causes them to leave or give up, et cetera. And so I just think as a business, like forget product for a second, just as a business, what a healthy set of customer-centric concerns to orient your whole team around. Whereas in transactions, you tend to get a little bit away from that humanity. It tends to be like, how do I close the sale? How do I get a bigger ticket size? How do I improve my take rate? What I love about subscription businesses is that it orients the whole team on basically that ongoing relationship. Your ideal is to have customers that are with you for years or decades. And I brought that at LinkedIn. Always felt like what was great about LinkedIn is that this is something that people would use throughout their careers, which is measured in decades. Financial advice at Wealthfront, once again, decades, right? Like these goals, etc. People want to save for their retirement, their kids' college. All these things take time.
What do you think Wealthfront did right in terms of like building that trust with customers? With Mercury, that was always, and that I would say it continues, even though we're much more mature, it continues to be like one of the hardest things. It's like, how do you get people to trust a fintech and mostly a digital experience with like all this money? I often say this story. We had, after we launched on a Tuesday, and on Friday, someone wired $1 million to a new Mercury bank account that just created, and I'd never spoken to the person, which I thought was like completely insane. But obviously, like people kind of, we all often think about like, how do you build trust? But, to some extent, we're doing it on the back of people like Wealthfront that have like trained people to be kind of happy about using fintech. So, what do you think Wealthfront did right in terms of like getting people to trust it?
And Matt, you just announced Mercury Investing, right? So you're like, are you doing something in this space or as well?
I guess there's a small bit of competition, but long way to go. But we have a passive investing thing as part of our personal banking product.
Yeah. Well, by the way, Imad, I'll tell you, I have literally a text on my phone from yesterday from a venture capitalist who is just effusively positive about the Mercury personal banking. So I'll just say like,
oh, nice.
You guys
you should try it, Adam.
Mercury is one of my, it's one of those feelings where I feel like so impressed with what you've built and the product and the service and use it. And then there's that little part of me that says like, yeah, but I'm not an angel in it. That's just, it's just a miss, et cetera. Life in the back. No, it's all okay.
You can partake in our Series D.
No, of course, yeah, and I would be happy to.
It's never too late.
But no, you asked a good question about Wealthfront, and I think it gets a little bit to my philosophy about building out products and that initial. I'm a little old-fashioned that way. I think the biggest problem that startups have, especially around products and go-to-market, is they get confused by what big companies do. In my career, I've worked at small companies, mid-size, large public companies. The problems are different. The challenge for the business is different. If you're trying to build trust, you can't design for everyone, right? Like you can't go for the mass market from day one, right? Like you're not going to hit everyone. You're not going to make everyone happy. You have to actually go for a subset of the market that really is feeling some pain and will be effusively positive about the solution you're building. And so, Wealthfront in the early days, I think the most brilliant thing they did, actually the pivot was brilliant as it turned out, right? They originally were a little bit more about building portfolios of stock and competition. They were a Facebook game when they were ka-ching. And Wealthfront came out of the idea of trust, which was, hey, the most trustworthy financial product is just going to be a low-cost, diversified portfolio of index funds. It might not be sexy or exciting, but that actually is the most trustworthy thing. It's what all the academics recommend. It really has the most grounding. And so that was the right product. And then but the biggest thing they did to build trust was in the early days, they focused very much on a subset of the market. Not even just millennials or young people making money. In the early days, it was very focused on like, hey, where's a sector where young people are finding success today? Oh, technology, right? What do Facebook engineers or Google engineers want? What do designers want, right, from a financial product and service? And what that let Wealthfront do is actually focus their design on really making that group not just try the product, but actually love it and recommend it. I mean, to this day, Wealthfront gets a huge percentage of their customer acquisition from referrals. And so I think that, as Wealthfront scaled, they broadened out.
They would also go to like Facebook and like tell the engineers about like, this is how you do wealth management, right? Like there was like this kind of things that don't scale element to
Oh,
that
no,
as
no,
well?
I did a number of that. Although that was a little bit brand building. The truth is, when we would go to a company, I do a talk, personal finance for engineers. I did it before Wealthfront. I've done it after. I even teach a class at Stanford now. But I would do that class for free at I think I did it at over 100 companies. But it was a little bit of brand building, right? Like there was that Business Insider post that went out, like, see the presentation that every Twitter employee got before the IPO. But that was me. That was us. That was Wealthfront. And so there were a lot of people who said, hey, if this service is good enough for the smart people who work at Facebook, Google, Twitter, and that sort of thing, then it's good enough for me. And so I do think that the way trust building works with startups, especially financial products, I don't know if you guys remember the Jeffrey Moore series of books from the 90s, Crossing the Chasm, Inside the Tornado, etc. But one of the takeaways there is that you start with a subsegment of the market, and then there's always adjacencies. They touch other people. And I remember seeing this at LinkedIn when it came to kind of the network effects of kind of it spreading out, right? Like people in different industries, different companies would adopt LinkedIn and would spread, right, virally. But it turns out a lot of financial products do too. People ask each other, like trust is a hard thing to earn. And so if you build a product that has good word of mouth where people really like it, I was always very focused at Wealthfront, like if someone asked you about Wealthfront, right, or about online services, would Wealthfront come up? And what would they say? Not just the name, but what would they say? I think, and then you design that into the product, right? You can do all the marketing you want, get the messaging right, but your product has to speak to what it is, because most of what your users are doing, most of your customers is using the product. And so if you want them to refer well, and then the great news is that it turns out, engineers don't just know engineers and designers, right? They have friends, they have family, lawyers, right? Academics, consultants, bankers. It turns out like what happened at Wealthfront is we started with kind of engineers and designers, but it turns out we spread to a lot of young people in their 20s and 30s who were in higher earning kind of careers, etc. And the really counterintuitive thing to the whole industry, of course, is that entire industry focuses on older people, because it turns out older people have most of the money. And I think that what Wealthfront did, which is going to stand the test of time, or at least it has already for more than a decade, is the fact that when you make customers happy, you grow with them. And I couldn't tell you at the time how happy I was to bet on the idea that, everyone's very down on millennials at the time and young people, right? Like, would they ever find financial
millennials
success?
have no money. Blah, blah,
I know.
blah,
Now all of a sudden everyone's talking about how successful the generation is. But 15 years ago, everyone's talking about how they don't have any money or they're not find success. And I loved building a business and a product that basically bet on their customer success, right? I was very convinced that all these Wealthfront clients that were coming in that didn't have much money in their 20s, a lot of them would go on to success in their 30s and 40s and 50s. And you know what? They would remember the services that took care of them when.
Yeah. I like the idea of making it so there's like product features that like lead to referrals. I was talking to someone at Wise, and they invested a bunch in this feature in the app, which makes it so it like basically hides all your personal details. So, if you're in person with someone, you're more likely to show the Wise app. But it also actually prompts people to think like, oh, there's a really prominent button here to hide all these details. Why is it here? Oh, I should tell my friends about this app. I think like doing those kind of smart product features is a good way to like get like actual referrals going.
Yeah, we had something like that at Wealthfront. It was kind of a fun thing because there's a problem in fintech where anyone who wants to show someone their app doesn't want to show their money. And so the Wealthfront app, when you shake it, like changes the currency
did the
and the
shaking
amount.
thing? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I think a few people have copied that.
But I personally prefer, I think those are all good and they're valuable features. But I think the real magic, and I think people get this wrong about network effects and viral distribution, et cetera. I think real spread and recommendations happen when it's really organic to the product, where the product itself, the feature itself truly gets better the more people who use it.
Is that true for Wealthfront though? Like that seems like
I don't think we ever.
rare.
I had some ideas back in the day. I don't think that's really where Wealthfront went. But like, for example, at Daffy, the reason campaigns is such a big feature for us is you have a member who wants to support an organization. You say, hey, you can run a matching campaign for them, right? And they say, great, that's going to make the nonprofit I'm supporting more successful. I want to do it. But naturally now they're in a position where they want to go tell people about the campaign. And as part of telling people about the campaign, they're actually telling people that Daffy exists and that this is something that they can do.
Yeah, that's an amazing feature.
Yeah. And so it turns out, I mean, like, you know, with Daffy campaigns, every campaign that runs, you know, on average, a certain number of people discover Daffy for the first time. And so I think it's hard in fintech, but I think that if you really push on it, you'll find, this is why I like getting to the humanity underneath the product. If you find the natural things that in the real world where people want to connect with other people, where the value comes from connection with other people, usually brilliant designers and engineers can come up with ways to turn that into an online version that actually does help build your brand and actually probably does better than any concerted marketing spend. I mean, I don't want to, at scale, you can spend a lot of money on marketing. So Apple spends billions on marketing, and let's be clear, it does work. But fundamentally, I think in the early days as a startup, finding those features where your customers become more than your customers, they become basically a sales force for the company, right? They're out there and they're not doing it because they make money. They're doing it because they actually like sharing and getting the credit for having discovered this service first, for finding the solution to their problem.
It has to be like native to the idea as well, right? I feel like some people like try to gamify these things and it doesn't work well.
Game mechanics, I'm a big fan of looking at video games and game mechanics for inspiration. I still do it today, right? There are features on Daffy that are very much inspired by what's working in mobile gaming today. But I think that it can help kind of in your design thinking, because really we are wired to like to play certain games and do certain things. But the product feature itself, the problem you're solving has to be the core of it. You can't just graft game mechanics on something and suddenly make it viral or have it explode. Like that doesn't, it's like empty calories. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, it doesn't work long term. I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think, also to your point on trust, I think that's a really important point. But actually on referrals, Mercury is a really good one to invite recipients. I'm constantly inviting recipients to like fill out their own profiles. And I think that's a really great way to promote Mercury. Like basically, so I don't have to put in the routing number and account number, right? And so
anything where there's like some level of B2B payments, there's like an inbuilt kind of virality. But it is hard to get a business that your recipient, whatever, it's hard to get them to then sign up for a bank account. Like actually, that it does drive some signups, but it's not like our biggest kind of source for sure.
Maybe just awareness. Yeah, maybe just awareness. But on the trust piece, one thing I found with B2B and enterprise sales, I think this is a really key insight that I learned at running Presto was like the key for a startup to sell to like big, like an industry like restaurant chains, like we were selling to. But I think this replicates across different industries, is getting that first brand. You get one brand to like your product. And it's extremely difficult to get that first brand because no one wants to work with a startup, right? Like, like a big brand like Applebee's, which eventually bought a product. Like they did a 2-year pilot, which is, later on you were doing 1-month pilots. But in the beginning, they did a 2-year pilot to just, make sure our product worked, our company would stay alive. And then after that, they had to roll out the product and it had to be successful for other companies to buy it in the space. And until that happened, which was many, many years, nobody else wanted to buy the product.
You couldn't just use the pilot to cross-sell other people? Like you needed the full deployment?
You need a full deployment because everyone is like doubting the startup can execute on like a big enterprise rollout. And it wasn't until they were happy that then the rest of the industry came like really quickly after that. So it was like, but the first one is a big slog. And so my advice to founders selling into B2B is like, the first logo, you got to do whatever it takes to get them, give it to them for free or like very low price for the first one, like do whatever it takes to get that first one. And then you can increase your price actually for every marginal customer because you're reducing the risk for every marginal customer.
Yeah, it's funny, and I will defer to both of you on B2B, but it turns out, at LinkedIn, we started purely consumer and then layered the enterprise business over it. At Daffy, I had the same requirement because we started getting this pull for business features. And so I kind of challenged the team saying like, listen, but like, if you want to approach this, like who's the lighthouse customer? Who are the design partners? How do we build this out? But you're right. Daffy for work. It's so much easier for companies to now adopt Daffy for work, knowing that OpenAI uses Daffy for work and a number of other companies, but that signature name really matters. We launched private stock. So most people don't realize that you can donate private stock to charity. And so we came up with an innovative new feature, which said, hey, if you're doing a tender offer, right? If you're letting employees, or a secondary, if you're letting employees sell anyway, let them donate some shares. It's smart for them, for their taxes. It doesn't cost the company anything. But I don't think we'd have as much demand for that this year if we hadn't got a company like Figma to do it last year, right? Everyone looks at Figma and goes like, hey, that's a great company, Dylan, culture, the whole thing they're building. So I agree with you. I think that, when I look at Daffy for work and the private stock platform, it's those initial customers that really make a big difference.
Absolutely. By the way, Imad, you and I have not talked about this. I'm curious, what is your giving strategy? What is your philanthropy strategy? Happy to share mine. I'll love to turn Adam's too.
I do some little stuff. So I'm quite suspicious of big stuff. So I have my family, my parents still go back to Pakistan 4 or 5 months of the year. And they have a whole network of people they give to, mostly kids to go through schooling, because public schooling sucks there. So if you're poor, even these private schools are not expensive. They're just basic schooling. It just doesn't exist in public schooling. So that's a very easy way. We support 10 plus families through that. And then I do some stuff in San Francisco. But in general, my main methodology is to get much, much richer. And then my impact will be much better in the future. But it is interesting. I don't think it's easy to give, which is part of the things that Daffy is trying to solve.
Adam, I'm curious to hear yours. What do you do?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Well, Daffy does reflect a little bit of the way that I tend to think about things, which might be a little overly rational for the space. But the behavioral finance is actually very clear, and actually the academic research is clear that actually the biggest step that you take with giving is actually just taking the step of putting some money aside for charity, right? It turns out that once you do that, yes, there's still a hard problem ahead of you of which organizations to support and which causes speak to you and et cetera. But it turns out how much money you can afford to give and then who to give the money to are both hard problems, and trying to do them at once is just how you get jammed up. And so that, for me, my philosophy has actually been, and it's a little bit old fashioned, but it's true in almost every culture. It's one of the most universal things around the world, is this idea that not everything is for you, right? Just getting out of your own selfish needs and realizing whether it's the fact that there are people less fortunate than yourself, whether there's actually big causes and problems that need help, whatever motivates you. For me, the big decision is just that step. I remember when LinkedIn went public, right? I know a lot of companies do this, et cetera, but for me, it was putting some of the money aside. And by the way, I didn't just do it for charity. I also did it for financial goals, where it was for me personally, that were very resonant, right? There are all these theories, risk mitigation, et cetera, where I was oh, I'm going to put aside the money for my kids' college education. I know that I could probably pay for it anyway, but I was my wife and I didn't want that over our heads at all anymore. But believe it or not, I think giving's the same. I've talked to a lot of founders who've done this. You might imagine with the private stock, et cetera. It turns out the tax benefit helps get people over the edge. It helps that the money can be invested tax-free, so they don't think that somehow the money is not compounding. But this is kind of why we built Daffy, was to make it very easy to make that decision to put money aside for charity, right? A lot of our product is designed around getting rid of the objections that people have about not giving, right? Oh, I don't know who I would give this much money to. That's okay. You can figure it out later. Just put the money aside for charity. Oh, I'm making a lot of money now. I want the money invested because it'll compound over time. That was Warren Buffett's famous reason initially for not doing it. Oh, that's okay. Your money will be invested tax-free. It will grow over time, right? Everything we've built into our product has tried to reduce the objections to make it easier to put money aside, with the confidence that once the money is put aside, and all the research shows this, it goes to charity, right? It might take you time to figure out which organizations. Maybe you'll start supporting organizations in a small way, and then they'll connect with you more deeply and you'll give more and more over time. Maybe it's just a time in life. Maybe you can't do it while you're building a company, or when your kids are small, but you have more time when they're older, et cetera. From my perspective, giving philosophy is that, all the problems we're talking about in the world, et cetera. I mean, this isn't a great thing. It's not a good thing, but it's a fact. Every year there are people in need, and every year there are problems. So I think it's much more important for people to take that first step of just putting money aside. And that's what my wife and I do, is we try to make sure that, we're like everyone in the Valley. So there's there's good years and then there's tight years and that sort of thing. The roller coaster is there.
Do you think about it as like a percentage? You're like, hey, if we ever get a windfall, 10% is put aside. Like, is that how you think about it, or how do you measure how much?
There's a little bit of that thinking, right? Like there's a lot of traditions about percentages, et cetera. But sometimes it's just an absolute amount, right? And think about donations. I don't know if there's a right. That was actually famously my initial round of user research and customer development for Daffy. I talked to dozens of people around the country. I put polls up because I wanted to see how people across the country thought about giving. And I really was hoping that there was a simple answer to that question, that I would go out and it'd be like, oh, everyone agrees you either give this much a percentage or this amount, and we could build a product around that. Oh man, if you ask 20 people in the US how much they should give to charity every year, you are going to get at least 20 answers. Like, it is not coherent. The good news that we discovered though was that almost everyone did have an idea. Like for almost everyone we talked to, the number was not zero. Right? There were very few people who believed that you should give. Levels? Yeah, actually, I think that's one of the myths out there. I think people think that this is much more tied to wealth, and some of the most generous people out there do not make a lot of money. This is not about that. It's about, once again, a very old-fashioned idea, usually taught by a teacher, a parent, a family member, somewhere,
the church,
that kind of says that, whatever your lot in life is, whatever you're struggling through, there are people less fortunate than yourself, and it's not all for you.
Are people becoming less charitable or more charitable? Like, is that like a trend line in one direction or the other?
There's a lot of debate about that right now. I don't know that I've seen conclusive data either way. I actually think that it all comes down to these definitions, right? The truth is that one of the top categories, if not the top category for a very long time in the US, has been to religious institutions. And by the way, we see that at Daffy. The number of donations at Daffy that go to, synagogues, that go to churches, that go to mosques, community centers, et cetera, across the country is one of the biggest categories. And I think there's a lot of reasons why those traditions bring people into giving. But actually, my impression around giving, et cetera, is that some of that stress and strain that's going on is because incomes are becoming more volatile at every level. By the way, almost at every income level, people have good years and not so good years, right? And so, of course, it's easier to give in the good years, but people really feel bad when they can't give in the not so good years. And by the way, nonprofit organizations, right, they have annual budgets, right? They hire people. Most nonprofits you talk to would rather have a consistent donation from you every year for 10 years than a big lump sum upfront. Right? It turns out that actually the way they run that would be better. So a lot of the idea behind Daffy, et cetera, was just to actually help people smooth that out, right? You put money aside in the years where it's easier to do so. And by the way, our tax system rewards that because tax rates are higher in the years where you make more money. And that way in the tight years, you can still support the organizations. No one wants to tell the organization that they support, a community organization that they've been involved with for years, that like, I can't give this year, right? No one enjoys that conversation, et cetera. It doesn't make them feel good. And so I actually think that a lot of what we're doing with Daffy and with donor advised funds in general is actually just doing what we do with a lot of other financial goals and tasks, is make it easier to put money aside for them when things are good so that you have money when those rainy days happen.
perhaps to segue hard into a very non-charitable thing, I thought it'd be fun to talk at least briefly about Soham Parekh. So this is quite a jump there. But yeah, it's been a really entertaining story on X. I guess for those people who aren't following, they should go read Sohail's original post. But there's this guy who's worked at like 50 plus startups, and he's worked
at the same time.
He basically just well, I don't know how many at the same time, but he's just like a machine at getting
he's crushing
jobs.
These interviews.
Yeah, he crushes the interviews, and people apparently say he's like very friendly and nice. But then he's working like lots of different jobs, and eventually gets found out and has been jumping around between Y Combinator companies. I actually looked it up. He did apply to Mercury. We didn't interview him in 2022. And then I also found this like investor update from one of our companies where they said, hey, we just hired this great machine learning engineer in 2021. It could be a different Soham, but I suspect it's the same one. So this guy's been prolific at this. That was actually a YC company as well. And it's interesting. I mean, we hire mostly remote. I think Raj is mostly remote, and Adam, you were saying it's like half remote, half in person. And it is like a thing that everyone worries about. That like, hey, you have these like, when someone was in person, like it's obviously they could still be not working, but it's just obviously harder. But with like combination of AI and remote work, like are people really giving their 100% to the company they signed up for?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. You made me think. There's also been those recent stories that are more tied to espionage, etc.
Oh yes, yeah, the North Korean crypto. Yeah, this is a major problem in crypto companies for sure.
It's a real issue. I think that and by the way, like it cuts across all forms of media, etc. But this proof of human is not just a joke, right? Like it's becoming harder and harder to just assume that who you're talking to on the phone or now who you're seeing in video is actually not just who they say they are, but even a real person to begin with and not synthetic. But yeah, I was disappointed. I did check our hiring thing. Unfortunately, he didn't apply to work at Daffy. So I felt like somehow did we not make the bar? Or, maybe we don't pay enough or it's too early stage, etc. It's amazing how that goes around. It was amazing to watch yesterday, just all the people checking their email going like, wait, he applied here. Like, oh, like he worked for one of my portfolio companies, that sort of thing. It was amazing to watch that happen.
To me, the most surprising reaction has been these people defending him. It's like, there's a whole set of people that believe like employees are like, this like, abused minority, and they should have the right to like work in lots of places and do whatever they want. Like I am probably not justifying their position well enough, but there is like this whole like set of people that like, what did he even do wrong? Which like it seems obvious to me they like did not follow through on what he said he was going to do, and then didn't even do the job, and he was like taking opportunities from other people. But yeah, Do either of you have any sympathy for him? Like, is there any place where you're like, oh yeah, it makes sense?
I mean, I think sympathy is a kind of interesting word. I mean, given the thing that touches, there's a reality. Like you can't be in the entrepreneurial world, right, with founders, et cetera, and not have some level of respect for the fact that there's a certain energy of trying to make your way in the world and there's a lot of founders and entrepreneurs who kind of look for cracks in the system and ask that question, like, why not? Why can't do it? This specific case, it's going to be hard, but I think that's because I do have also for Silicon Valley, a fairly old-fashioned bias about how hard it is to build companies, et cetera, and what it takes to get a team together, to push through those hard times, to do those extra things. We tend to only read about the success cases and then the things that are up and to the right, and always feels like...
I do think that's one thing that makes it particularly disappointing. Like, it's not like he's going after the companies that made it, right? Like, he's going after startups that like, often as a founding engineer, he's like the first 2 or 3 people, and like, these people don't have much money. They're struggling, and like, he's kind of abusing that trust, and they don't have the recruiting processes in place and the interviewing processes to like try to catch bad actors like that. So that is like something that like, he's not going after the big guys, he's going after the little guys.
Yeah, and let's be clear, I think there are all sorts of legal and otherwise reasons why like it's not okay across the board. but you're right. I think for me personally, it's very hard. Like there's a reason I actually do a guest lecture at Stanford Business School every year talking about how to build ownership cultures and why giving equity is so important. And I remember these debates, going back to, business school. If you go globally, Silicon Valley was very, very unusual around this idea that everyone at your company should have equity. Everyone should feel like an owner of the company. But the research is incontrovertible about that ownership mentality. It's not just about people working hard or taking less cash. It actually lets you rise above the problems around your individual concerns and focus on the real thing that should align everyone, which is that if we make this company successful, it's not just good for our customers. It's not just good for our investors. Like, we're all in this together, right? There's a little bit of collectivism that comes from all being owners in the company. And actually feeling that way. And by the way, compensation isn't enough to do it. So when I see things like this, it's very hard for me to have any sympathy, because it just goes at the heart of what I think makes startups work in the first place, right? I actually don't think you can build big scaled, successful companies reliably based on a mercenary culture of just, everyone coming in and, checking the box and making sure that, oh, yep, this is the way I can make the most money in the shortest amount of time. Like, I don't think that works. And it certainly doesn't build anything durable. So.
Yeah, I had one comment on this, which is like, I've seen this before. Like we had at Presto, we had 2 or 3 employees who were doing this, and we cut them out and got rid of them. And we also called their other companies that they're working for and told them, so, and we sent a very explicit warning email to everyone in the company that if they were.
How did you find them?
In some cases, they had multiple LinkedIn accounts. Like I remember that was, with different like name, like, one would be like, say, Martin P, and the other would be Martin, like, like their full name, right? And like, that was one case. I think in one case, an employer called me and, there were some just random, like, fact patterns that ended up like resulting in like, oh, this person is working at multiple companies. It was, I think, pretty common in the pandemic. Some, not all were engineers too. Some were like recruiters, like, full-time recruiters. Like, I remember one case in particular. But I think this is a real risk for remote companies. Iman, I know you're a very big remote company, like 800 plus, I don't know, 1,000 people now? I don't know what you are now.
1,000 people, yeah.
Yeah, 1,000 people, yeah. I would be surprised if there were like not a few people who are doing this at your company. Like, so like, the thing, the advice I give to founders is like, if someone is a remote employee, you need to have extremely high standards, almost like unreasonably high standards for the performance. It's hard to find if they're like working at other companies, but if you have any doubts about them at all, about their, showing up for a meeting or not getting their weekly work done, you should just get rid of them, and you don't even take any risk. That's the best way to catch this, is like have extremely high standards for performance. And once we did that, everything worked well, I think, after that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that like is sad about it, to go back to Adam's kind of ownership point, is like there is an element of like, trust that and like breaking this kind of social contract by like these abusers. Like, I would like to, to go back to your performance thing. Yeah, if someone's like not performing well, like, is it like, hey, we need to give them more training or help them, or is, like there's normally like a plethora of things that you do. If it comes down to like, oh, actually, like there's a reasonably high chance that they're just doing 2 jobs, and like now you don't have a culture where like you help people when they're like early in their career or like struggling through something, and you're like have to quickly jump to this conclusion that like maybe they're unethical. Like it does like kind of destroy something there. I think one thing that does help is, we do insist on people being in like US and Canada mostly. Like we have some exceptions, but I think that helps a little bit. Like obviously you have, there's plenty of great people in every country, but there's a level of like, both culture in the US and Canada that like I think will hopefully reduce the number of people that want to do it, but there's also like some more legal ramifications where like if people do this, like, to whatever extent that it's illegal, like you could go after them, which probably like stops people wanting to do it as much.
Well, to be clear, you asked about sympathy, before, but this does exist. Like, people do work for, they're called consultants. right? Like, contractors can take jobs with multiple companies, and it's usually pretty explicit, right? When you do so, I think when people do this, they know what they're doing is they're kind of rationalizing, kind of saying, well, I'm kind of behaving like this other pattern, but I'm not being transparent about it. And I'm not being transparent about it because I don't think they would let me do this. And so like fundamentally, that's the moment where like I'm misleading someone to do something that they wouldn't enter into willingly, right?
Mm-hmm.
The company wouldn't let me do this. And then it comes down to trust. But to our earlier conversation, I do think that it can be negative for trust within the company. I think we saw a lot of this in the pandemic, by the way, like with remote work, et cetera. Like, how do I know that people are working, or how do I know that they're doing the right things? Or it makes it very hard to build a culture, a trust-based culture. And the truth is, when everyone's looking over their shoulder or policing things, it starts feeling more mercenary, right? Like it almost sets in a toxic cycle where the companies and managers are almost incentivized to kind of push more and more oversight, which feels like less trust. And then when you ask your employees for trust, like not surprisingly, it's harder for them to give because they don't feel as trusted. And so I just think, at scale, you kind of have to deal with these things, and it's part of building up a scale organization, et cetera. But, in the early days, I just think it's almost impossible to get by that. I mean, I don't know how we would build Daffy without a high trust organization. I mean, we're also mission driven, et cetera. I mean, with the boom going on right now in AI, et cetera, everyone here at Daffy knows they could be doing other things. They're at Daffy because, not just because of the product, not just because of the mission, it's because of what they feel like they're learning, but it's also because of the team and the trust they have. And so anything that hurts that, I don't know. I just have some scars early career of how hard that is. Like, even we were talking about Apple in the early days. I can't tell you how hard it was in the late 90s at Apple, just because there was this trust thing around press leaks.
Yeah.
And talking and how that undermined kind of who was talking to who about what.
Yeah. I guess the theme of this conversation has been like building mission-based companies and how you do that, which is not easy and like definitely more of an art than a science. We should probably wrap. Adam, it's been great to have you on. We should have you on again in the future.
No, always happy to. It's great to see you guys, of course.
Definitely.
Thanks everyone for listening. Please leave us a review on whatever channel you're listening on. Makes a big difference to the algorithm and to the success of the show. And see you all next week.